Hello, my name is David Postansky and welcome to the Geek Battle Gaming YouTube channel. Today we are going to be doing a review of the Atari 2600 Plus. So if you haven't done so already, make sure you smash that subscribe button over on youtube.com/@geekbattlegaming. And without further ado, let's get into it. The Atari 2600 review. What's old is new again. The Atari 2600 is back. The year is 2023 and you can forget all your 4K this and teraflop that. The new Atari 2600 Plus console is all about blowing in your cartridges and using a joystick with one button. One button! Yes, the Atari is one of the most iconic brands in the world. And I don't just mean in the world of video games, it is one of those things that most people have heard of. Many of us grew up with Atari, and the likes of Pong, Asteroids and Centipede are some of the most famous of all video games. Younger gamers may not know it as well, because despite being the granddaddy of all video game makers, they've struggled since the mid-1980s. The Nintendo Entertainment System took Atari's crown as the home video game console, and although Atari stayed in the game with the 5200, the 7800, the Atari Lynx and the Atari Jaguar, or Jaguar as some people pronounce it, it was never able to recapture the magic or success of the original Atari 2600, also known as the original Atari VCS, not to be confused with the modern 2020s one. In the years since the Atari Jaguar failed at retail, the Atari company has passed through multiple hands, and the current version of the company have been on something of a mission to revitalise their brand. Their focus has been on the modern retro gaming market, and the Atari 2600 Plus is the latest and perhaps greatest of their output. The new console is a slightly smaller recreation of the original design of the Atari 2600 aesthetically, if I can pronounce that correctly, but my understanding is that the internals are emulation based and that it's just loads the game, it dumps the ROM and loads the game in and runs it that way. Some people aren't so keen on this, that it should have the original circuits and hardware inside, but as long as it works, that's all that matters to me. Atari have put a full list of games that are compatible, and from what I could tell, I see that the majority of games are. There are a few that aren't, and notable exceptions include the likes of Pitfall 2, James Bond 007, and He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. I think this is a bit of a bummer if I'm honest, because I'm particularly interested in tracking down old licensed games based on IP like He-Man or James Bond, because these are unlikely to ever get re-released the same way that you can get Breakout and Pong on 20 different devices. Over the years there have been tons of homebrew Atari 2600 games, and so far there doesn't seem to be an official list of which of these games will be compatible on the 2600 Plus. One of the most exciting aspects of this console being re-released, or released as it is the Plus version, is that it will surely see more homebrew games made, and will also possibly see more of these getting released with limited or wider runs on actual physical cartridges. To accompany this new console, Atari have released several new cartridges themselves. This includes the fantastic Mr. Run and Jump, which is the first new game from Atari released for the 2600 in 30 odd years. When I got Mr. Run and Jump, it came in this cool box which you open up and then you get a smaller sleeve with the cartridge inside. Now that's a game that you have to buy separately, but if you do get just the console, it does come with this in it. It's a shame that they didn't give you a bigger box, but that would mean a bigger box probably is required for the console overall, so I understand why they didn't do that. And when you take this out here, you can see that on the back it has dip switches, and you have to reposition these to match the position of the corresponding game that you want to get started, and then the game will play. Simples. If you haven't seen it already, do check out my full and detailed review of the 2600 version of Mr. Run and Jump, which is already on the channel. Now, I hope this leads to them making other new games, and they have put out a new enhanced version of Bezerk and a multi-cart of 4 games that come with some paddle controls. Included in the box with the system is a 10-in-1 cartridge that gives you the likes of Adventure, Yar's Revenge and Haunted House. This is certainly enough to get new players going on the system, although I expect that any players who are buying the system to use old carts will already have copies of things like Combat, Missile Command and Video Pinball. Rounding out the 10 games are Maze Craze, Real Sports Volleyball and Dodgem. The cart comes with dip switches on, so you have to manually adjust the switches on the cartridge to make it load the various games. This is very, very super retro, oh yes indeed, and I've seen some complain that this should have been achieved with a menu when you switch on the console. Maybe this is possible, but to me I like that part of this experience is that it feels like an old school experience that you would have had literally in 1977 or 1981 or whatever, and they kind of bring back that feeling. Everything can be done as a download nowadays if we really wanted, but if we're choosing to buy old school products like this, I don't mind a little bit of the quirky old school experience like dip switches. Another of these quirks from the original that may take modern players by surprise is that there are a bunch of switches on the console itself, and you'll need to be familiar with these to get the most out of the games. Changing difficulty levels and sometimes even starting gameplay is done with the switches on the console itself. The design is based on the 4-switch Atari 2600 and not a 6-switcher, which, whilst I know some would have liked to have seen that, I think they did as much as they could to be able to shrink down the console while still feeling like a legitimate home console and not just a mini console or Atari flashback device. One question I think a lot of people had is, who is this console for? Atari have been great at leveraging their classic IP in recent years, and they've taken many steps to remind old players and educate new ones about their library of franchises. This has been done with the recharged games which have been released on modern consoles, and in one sense those games will lead players to revisit the old Atari 2600 and arcade games of versions like Centipede and Black Widow, and that's going to happen just as much as the Atari 2600 games is going to lead people towards the recharged games and any modern sequels or remakes. Last year, Atari released the 50th anniversary collection on every modern console under the sun, and that gave you over 100 classic games to play. As an owner of the modern Atari VCS, I noticed that a lot of these were already available as part of the Atari Vault collections on the VCS console. Then Atari also released a new iteration of the Atari Flashback Plug and Play to celebrate the 50th anniversary, and this had 100 plus games on it as well. Plus you can download some of the classic games individually on the VCS store, and then there is the Atari 50 home arcade machine, and let's not forget the Atari Game Station Plug and Play Pro system from My Arcade, which has also just been released. The point is, there are tons and tons of ways to play all of these games. If you were to buy them all, you could legitimately have about 7 or 8 different ways to play something like Centipede, which is available to purchase online or in stores right now. So again, I ask, who is this for? It's great in one sense that Atari have given players so many options to revisit their old games, but my concern is that with so many ways to play, can they all be successful? The Game Station Pro allows you to add ROMs, but doesn't let you play original carts. The Atari VCS, the modern one, has games on it that are Atari games, modern ones like the recharge stuff, and then it has indie games, and then it has the old classic games that you can play. Whereas the Atari 2600 Plus, which we're reviewing today, is all about the original cartridges. I appreciate that they released a way for players to play their old collection, and as a 7800 owner, I love that this is forward compatible with those games as well. I do half wonder if they could have released all of these ideas perhaps as one device to be the ultimate Atari box. There is a certain appeal to mini consoles or recreations of old old hardware, and I do understand that. But I imagine if this had been a device that looks like an Atari 2600, plays original carts from the 2600 and 7800 through a cartridge slot, but also had 200 games built in like the Game Station Pro has, well, I think that would be a lot more successful and have even wider appeal. Unless Atari plan to re-release all of the old games, it won't be easy for some players to track down certain old cartridges that haven't been available from the shops in over 35 years. A premium version of the device could have been what the VCS is, or I guess what I'm saying that the VCS could have included a cartridge slot for backwards compatibility as well. But heck, I'm sure Atari knows what they are doing, and that there will be players that will buy all three of the Atari 2600 Plus, the Game Station Pro, and the VCS just to play Pong 3 times over. The system comes with one joystick, and it is very true to the original. This is both good and bad. It's great that it's faithful, but it's also true that gaming controllers have improved a little bit since 1977, and I found the joystick that came with the 2600 Plus here to be very stiff. It's fine for many games, but I found that I was longing for a joypad when playing Mr. Run and Jump to review that game. I'm sure it's just because it's new and with lots of use, it will either loosen up slightly or I'll just get used to the feel of the old school controller. If you're not happy with the controller, the good news is the console will work with a variety of other controllers that have the same old school Atari port. So bad news, your Bluetooth and your USB controllers won't work here. But if you have original joysticks or game pads from the Atari 2600 or 7800, they should work just fine.
Wow, this is smaller than the original.
I tested a bunch of controllers on the system, and this is what I found. The old joystick that I'd had from my Amiga 500 and Atari ST still work great. I have various from companies like QuickShot, and they all worked for me and made some games easier to play. I also tested my Sega Master System joypad, and it works fine as well. The bad news is that I also tried multiple Sega Mega Drive / Sega Genesis controllers, and they did not work at all. This included both official Sega pads and third-party ones from companies like Competition Pro. This is a shame as they have the same port, but I guess the internals aren't quite the same, don't match up, and won't allow it to be used. I did look up and found there may be adapters available which will make it work with a Sega Mega Drive pad, but it's probably just easier to get a new controller if you want one. I have a Retron 77 and the joystick from that worked a treat, and I slightly preferred it to the official one that came with the 2600 Plus.
For me, playing the Atari 2600 Plus, I ended up using the Hyperkin Retron 77 controller just because it's a little bit easier on the corners of your hands there. It has a second button which is also useful, and just look at how loose that is in comparison, which some people may not like because it doesn't feel authentic, but for me it just made gameplay easier.
It was slightly looser and easier to control, and also it's got buttons on both sides, so it made it easier to control Mr. Run and Jump with my left hand, because I'm used to controlling characters' movements with my left hand, like using the D-pad, etc. There is also the Hyperkin Ranger controller, which combines a mini joystick, which is closer to a D-pad in function, and the Hyperkin Ranger also has a paddle built in. I haven't got one of those yet, but I will get one in the near future and see what it's like with this. Atari have also themselves re-released paddles which you can get to use with this, but I didn't get one to test for this review and don't have any original paddles, so again, when I get some that come up with the new release, then I will get them and see what they're like. One of the best things about the console is it allows you to play your old school cartridges on modern TVs with an HDMI cable. This is great! And it's also great as it's a solution to have both the 2600 and 7800 being able to be on an HD TV in this respect. Like I mentioned, I do have a Retron 77, and that allows you to play Atari 2600 games on high definition televisions, but I've been stuck on the 7800 front, so this is good that Atari's solution sorts this itself.
So the good news is this thing will also play games from the Atari 7800. So let's give that a go.
With the new carts that they've released, it's got me thinking a little bit. Mr. Run and Jump and Bezerk Enhanced will work on the original Atari 2600 consoles if you have them, and that is cool. Even if new players don't buy the Plus, they can still get these new games to sell them to people who had the original hardware. But this has got me concerned in at least one regard. As the 2600 Plus can also play 7800 games, they could, in theory, make new games that would work on the 7800 and would be much more advanced than the games that they could produce nowadays just for the 2600. We could get some brand new 7800 level games, which I think, is very exciting, if not more so than getting new Atari 2600 games. The 7800 didn't get many games on it back in the day, but it's also true that not many people had the original 7800 hardware. If Atari are serious about putting out some new cartridges that will work on the 2600 Plus, I hope to see some that are 7800 level quality games. But my gut feeling tells me that this is less likely, as the 7800 was in a similar wheelhouse to the Nintendo Entertainment System. It could have more advanced games that are created for it, and that would be more time consuming and costly to make than games that are designed based around the Atari 2600 hardware, as Mr. Run and Jump was. And I get that, but I also worry that they would look at the market and say there aren't many people with the original 7800 consoles, and therefore let's not make new games for the 7800 because it won't have as big an install base based on who owns either the original 2600 or 7800. In a theory, that means that the 2600 Plus may only get 2600 level games because more people own the original 2600 than people own the 7800. That would be a real shame, because literally the console they're selling now can play 7800 games, and I'd love to see a sequel to Mr. Run and Jump that is in an Atari 7800 style. One can hope, but the Atari 2600 Plus could turn out to be something of a revival and redemption for the Atari 7800 all these years later. The 7800 could have released much earlier than it originally had, and if it hadn't been for Atari going through some issues, it would have actually been out in a similar time frame to the NES, and it would have probably given Nintendo a much better run for its money. I hope that Atari do give this console support with several new cartridges. Over the past couple of years they have released expensive special edition cartridges of old games, but the new carts that have accompanied the launch of the 2600 Plus have all been much more reasonably priced. Mr. Run and Jump, for example, was $24.99 on Amazon, and I'd say that $19.99 would have been the optimal price to convince me to buy a few more games here and there. If this sells well enough, I'd love to see some third-party support on the console, even if it's just things like, they were back in the day, and Atari actually make the new games based on third-party franchises. I'd be okay with that. I'd quite like to see a new version of Pac-Man made from the ground up for the Atari 2600 that would redeem the rushed-out port that came out back in the day. Similar thoughts, imagine if they were to get the rights and put out a remade or enhanced version of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, where they cleaned up the gameplay, improved the graphics and the sound, made it make a bit more sense that you knew what to do. That would be a true redemption story to bring a happily ever after for E.T. the Extraterrestrial, the Atari game. More than that though, I would like to see Atari 2600 or 7800 versions of games like Resident Evil, Call of Duty, Final Fantasy and Minecraft. I mean, why not? Imagine if new retro games based on these titles that didn't even exist when the 2600 was originally out saw a release in like 2024. How cool would that be? Like a Resident Evil Super D-Make or a Call of Duty game, which is basically, I don't know, like almost like Space Invaders or something like that, where you just got one guy and he shoots a bunch of enemies, and that's Call of Duty. Or, like Adventure, but it's branded as Final Fantasy, and I'd love to see these kind of things happen. So, anyway, the big question is whether you should get the Atari 2600 Plus or not. The answer will depend on a couple of things. Do you have a collection of 2600 and or 7800 games? If so, and you want to play them on an HD TV, then this hardware will be exactly up your street. You know, it's going to be a lot easier than trying to maintain a 40-year-old console that could break down at any time, because this is brand new. But be warned, there are a few games that won't be compatible, including the likes of James Bond and Pitfall 2. This would also be a great machine for you if you want to get into collecting but currently haven't started. It's just been released, but I'm sure it won't take long before we get news on this being modded or hacked in some form or fashion. The console has a single USB Type-C port which is used to supply power, but it may just be that this port can be connected to a computer or hacked in some way for firmware updates. I'm sure something like this will happen sooner rather than later. If you just want a quick way to play Atari games and you don't want to have the bother of cartridges or having to start collecting stuff, I'd suggest getting either an Atari Flashback or the Atari Game Station Pro. Or you could just download games on the Atari VCS store and get the Atari 50 collection, which has loads of the same games on it. For me, I'm very happy with the console so far. All of the games I've tested work just fine, and I'm excited to be able to use this to be able to record gameplay in HD, to be able to make more videos about it in the future. So the big question now is, have you played Atari today? I know I have.
So there you have it, my review of the Atari 2600 Plus. So should you get it or not? That depends what kind of gamer you are. If you're someone that's got a whole stock of old Atari 2600 and 7800 cartridges, or you're someone who would like to be in the future and want to collect them, then get this. You'll be able to play them on HD TVs, and this will be a system which is brand new, so it's not going to break and go wrong like some of these old Atari machines do from 70s and 80s and like 40 odd years ago is basically what I'm trying to say. But should you get this? I think you should. If you're someone that just wants something to plug and play, then perhaps go for the Game Station Pro, or get the Atari collection that came out on all manner of systems last year, PS5, Switch. You can get it on the Atari VCS. The VCS gives you a ton of ways to play these old games as well. Plus you could get one of the old Atari Flashbacks. There's loads of ways to play Atari. So I think the real question is not have you played Atari today, but on what system did you play Atari today? Because there's tons of options, and for me, this is a really good one if you want original cartridges. So with that, that's going to wrap up this review. My name is David Postanski. I'd really appreciate it if you would smash that subscribe button over on youtube.com/@GeekBattleGaming. So if you like the video, give me a comment, give me a thumbs up, leave some remark and I will respond to it. I try to respond to all of the comments. It will help the channel, and if you could hit that subscribe button and share the video as well. All of these things I'm asking for you to do. I know it's terrible, but it will help me so that I can keep making these videos, and hopefully you enjoyed it, and that's the most important thing. So until next time, make sure you check out the article version of this video over on www.extremed.tv. And with that, from me, from everyone else, stay safe, always stay extremed, and ciao for now. And we're off the air.